I'd like to turn it over to our panelists and invite them to come join me up here. Our next session is making the business case. This was an area that many of our webinar participants back in February and those who participated in a pre-conference focus group expressed a lot of interest in. So we shifted the schedule to make sure that we spend adequate time on this topic. So I know we have a great session in front of us, and I'd like to ask my panelists, once they get settled, to please introduce themselves. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you, Sarah. I am Tom Chester. I'm the Deputy Commissioner and Chief of Staff for the Department of General Services. For those of you who were at the dinner last night, as I explained them, I have been here since 1973. John Hull, while he may not necessarily say I'm older than dirt, does say I am a monument, kind of like some of our other facilities that we have. So I've been here for a while. I want to talk to you this morning about how we built our business case on determining we needed to outsource facility management. And I can't do that without at least giving a little bit of the history of how the heck we got here. So let's do that. Ain't technology great? All right, go to the next one. All right. Notice the picture. I'm going to come back to that. Make note of that picture because it says volumes, and I'll come back to it at the right time. Okay. Obviously, in 2011, we determined that what we've been doing over the years was not working. Some of our challenges obviously were most of the work we did was reactionary. There did not seem to be a plan by our facility staff to ever look in advance what they needed to do. It was more of a, when it breaks, we'll fix it. That came from a number of things. One, it came from being able to hire qualified individuals at the salary that the state was able to pay. Those of you that are in state government should not be surprised that, you're not going to sign on in state government to make your fame and fortune. Okay, you come for other reasons. But that also impacts what you were able to do as far as offering salaries to those technical experts that you need to do the job, whether you're talking about the maintenance staff, whether you're talking about the electricians or the plumbers or even the folks who are managing the buildings. You end up, like we say in too many cases, you get what you pay for. And that was a challenge over the years. Not only did you have the problem of attracting folks to come work for the state. Once they got here, you had to deal with whatever expertise they brought to the table, and we had no means really to train them up. There was nothing in place to teach them the things that they didn't know. There was nothing in place for those who did know something were able to do anything to continue to teach them up on the changing technology. And that was a challenge over the years. One thing I should point out, when we began this process, State of Tennessee had 9 buildings in the downtown Capitol complex. 1989, and I'll share the importance of that in a moment, in 1989 we had 15. So we added 6 buildings in that period of time. 1989, one of the attempts we made to address how do you fund the operation of the buildings? How do you hopefully stand up a better staff to be able to manage those buildings? Was the creation of Facilities Revolving Fund. We refer to it as FERF. And I've been told stay away from the acronyms because I can stand up here and say 2 sentences and never use a single word other than the acronym. I've done it in the legislature before. But the idea behind FERF was to create a central housing pool by which every agency that came into the fund would pay rent for the operation. We would also charge a fee that would build reserves to do the things in the future that we needed to do. You've heard us all talk about deferred maintenance and the fact that it got out of control, and it is still out of control. The idea worked well for about 3 years. The feds came in and went, I'm sorry, I understand what you're trying to do. However, you can only charge actual cost. So it's been kind of a downhill path ever since then. About half of our portfolio, we charge a rent that should cover what a normal real estate company would cover in their rent charges. The other half pay actual cost. So we struggle to pay for the operations, let alone put enough money into the reserves to pay for the deferred maintenance. Okay? One of the other challenges that we had was the ability to track what it is we were doing. 1991, we purchased a system to assist the FM staff to be able to do that very thing. They could actually inventory their assets in their various facilities. They could then set up the PMs that were necessary, schedule those PMs, track how they were doing. And that rocked along for about 3 years, and then the staff determined, oh, this is too hard. We can't do this. We just don't have the time to continue to put all this stuff into the system, and they just stopped. So we ended up between 1993 and until we outsourced, basically using it as a glorified work order system. Okay? So needless to say, that these are the kinds of things that we were faced with what we were able to do internally within the Department of General Services in managing our facilities and with the staff that we had. All right. Obviously, if we are struggling to identify what we're doing in the buildings and do any pre-planning, another area that we did not do very well in was being able to benchmark ourselves against industry standards or other states, primarily because as the fiscal director at that point in time, we would set our accounting system based upon what did the facility management folks want to know in the way of data for their facilities. This day and time, you're looking for certain key elements of the types of services you're providing in your facilities. Back then, they had an idea of what they wanted to look at and only those things, so it did not give us the ability of comparing apples to apples. Okay? And there was not a lot of benchmarking that was done. The one thing we did find as we went through the late 2000s in the 2010s was that when we did comparison to such issues as the annual BOMA report, we were out of kilter with that. I mean, when you looked at their categories and ours, and you looked at the overall cost of similar buildings, we were way out of line with what it should cost to operate a facility. As I said before, state expense categories, I mean, it would take literally weeks if someone asked us to do an analysis on a particular building, or God forbid they ask us to do an analysis on the entire portfolio. It would take us weeks to try and take what data we had that came from our FM folks and squeeze it into something that looked like the reasonable report to compare it to something like BOMA, or compare it to what another industry standard would be for the real estate industry. Not only did we have the challenge of, so what buckets were we putting those expenses in, the allocation of expenses became a major problem within the FM staff. Many cases, rather than direct expenses being charged to a facility where maybe they did a repair, too many cases, the labor and the parts ended up being allocated based upon a square footage. So obviously, to say over a period of time, there are those buildings that probably were overstated to a good degree as to what it really cost to operate those buildings because of the way that we had to go about allocating costs, because at the end of the day, that's what our job was to take what we had and make it work within the system. All right. This has a double-fold meaning. One, obviously, costs were out of control. You heard me say before, we had no good means by which to compare our data to what was going on in the real world. We also had to deal with the issue of the deferred maintenance, as we've talked about. As I grew up in state government, I remember the officials of state government yelling and screaming, oh my goodness, it's $5 million. $5 million became 50. 50 became 200. 200 became almost $750 million over time, primarily for several reasons, and not limited just to deferred maintenance, but also your operational expenses. There were limited funds during this period of time that I've been in state government. As the fiscal officer, from '83 until 2004, I became an expert in budgeting in reverse. And by that I mean figure out what I didn't get this year that I didn't have last year and calculate next year what I need less than the year before. It's an art if you can do it, but we got very good at it because too many years in that period of time, our state revenues were so limited, there was only so much you could do. So you ended up surviving is what you did. You heard me speak about the ever-mounting deferred maintenance balance. Preventative maintenance. I'm not sure that ever entered into the dictionary for our FM staff. Like I said, too many cases it was more about if it's broke, we'll do something. If not, then we'll sit in the office and wait for somebody to call us and tell us something's not working. Not a good approach. You heard me talk about cost right of control. There was no centralization. You have to imagine that the way we operated our facilities, good, bad, or otherwise, every facility stood on its own. Every facility had its own staff. So there may not be anything going on in the AJ building for weeks at a time, and you got staff almost sitting in the office twiddling their thumbs hoping something would break. But you had duplicate staffs in all the buildings. So you had a collection of technical expertise that was not being used and limited by the fact of you were paying for what you were getting and had no way to train them up and no way to keep them with what the breaking edge of technology is today. You were getting whatever they brought to the table when they were hired on. The other area we had was to augment those staff people in the facilities. We contracted out. Janitorial, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, we contracted for all those things that we knew we really did not have the ability to do in-house ourselves. Problem is, try and manage 107 different janitorial contracts. The procurement time and method in that is just staggering in what you have to do, but you consider what you have to do from a contract management point of view. 107 janitorial, 72 alarm systems, and 35 emergency generator contracts. That's a large task to lift, and we did not do a very good job. Government does not always do a good job of managing contracts, especially the ones that were written back in the 80s and the 90s and even in the 2000s. But the world has changed as to the way we write contracts now and what we expect out of our contractors. Back then, these were all mostly, you gave them a set of standard specs, and then you did low bid. Seems simple enough. Well, nothing was simple back then as far as trying to manage these contracts. All right, one of the things I wanted to do, if I can go back to it. All right, I want you to focus on that picture again. I do want to say one thing at this point. One of the things that we did for making a decision on how to try and manage our facilities better back in the 80s and early 90s is we actually contracted facility management out in certain buildings. So this has been nothing new for the state of Tennessee. When the James K. Polk building came online, we used a building management contract to operate that for 15 years. When the Citizens Plaza came on board, we brought in a contractor to manage the building. When we brought the Rachel Jackson building on board, when we brought the new data center on board down by Bicentennial Mall, we used a contractor to manage that. Even when we bought the old Interstate Life Insurance building in Chattanooga, we used an outsourcer to manage that building for us. One of the things that happened during these budget cuts, there comes that point in time where they say, cut your budget by 8% or 10%, and you're looking for ways to do that. We determined, the management of the department at the time, decided that we would reduce our budget by canceling the contracts. We can do it cheaper with state employees. Now we're back to where we were in the other buildings and before, going, that's great. So how do you manage this with limited technical expertise, which led us to 2011. The significance of this picture is this. When Steve Cates, who was first commissioner under Governor Haslam, came on board, one of the things he wanted to do was walk around and get a feel for our real estate within FERF. He was walking through the Andrew Jackson building garage with Commissioner Roberts of the Department of Revenue. As they were standing and discussing the building, the fact that that was one of those that we really needed to modernize, this is a chunk of concrete that fell out of the ceiling of the garage and almost hit the Commissioner of Revenue. This picture really doesn't do this justice as to how large a piece this is. I can assure you that they would have been naming the deputy commissioner, the acting commissioner, the next morning if it had hit him. That kind of set in motion back to my idea that I used as a slide. We need a new plan. This ain't working. Because not only did we not take care of the normal things in the buildings, we had no ability to walk around and go, you know, that's going to be a problem. We need to get a structural engineer in here and figure out what to do about that. And it was the same way through all the other facilities. Staff did the best that they can do. I don't want to sound like I'm disparaging staff this morning. They did the best they could do with what they had to work with. But it just plain did not work. So that brought us to the cusp of we need to do something else. There's a better way of going about this. And that's how we came to this point in time. I'm going to bring Ron Plum to the podium and let Ron walk you through some of the additional building the case. And this is where we get into the weeds. Ron?
Good morning. I'm Ron Plum, as Tommy said, the Chief Financial Officer of General Services. I've been with the state for about 29 years, the last 12 or so with General Services. I was here before and after the decision was made to contract out. And so my role this morning is to try to give you a sense of what we did to paint the picture for the decision makers to make the decision they did. I prepared some remarks to make sure I get through this in a focused manner. So, but first, I'd like to echo a couple points that were made yesterday. There's somebody mentioned about data and metrics. We're not sexy, a sexy subject, and I agree with that. But if they really do have the ability to tell you the story, if you look down deep into the numbers, they talk to you. They explain what it is that is happening, and that's what the decision makers are looking for, something that's data driven. So it was back in the summer of 2012 when our agency began a concerted effort to determine how the state-owned facilities contained within FERF compared to the industry standard as far as the cost to operate the portfolio was concerned. In particular, we were to determine how we stacked up against similar type facilities that reported costs annually in the BOMA report. We were asked to take a deliberate, detailed look, as detailed as we could, based on what we had, into the cost of the ongoing FM operations. For a bit of perspective here, up to that point in 2012, our only attempt at comparing to BOMA had been in the annual report that we did for the budget office, whereby we just summed up all the all the costs to the buildings in the portfolio and divided it by the number of square feet that we had on the books. And we compared that to the total number in the BOMA report. Didn't really get very deep there. So the figures we were reporting at that point only provided a macro view of facility management operations. We simply aggregated them, like I said. We didn't have the ability to dig any deeper than that in a timely manner. Now you might ask yourself, how can I interpret the results of such a high-level comparison of costs? Well, you really can't, can you? In addition, up until the fall of 2012, due to the lack of a viable FM reporting system that Tommy mentioned, that we tried to start back in the early 90s, and the fact that the vast majority of FM costs were not posted directly to the facility level, we were forced to allocate the cost based on the square footage in order to obtain the cost of operating our individual buildings. In case you aren't familiar with the reason why we need to track our costs at the facility level, it's so that we can establish an annual rent rate which is based solely on actual expenses, thus enabling those of our tenants who operate federal programs to use their federal revenue when they're paying their rent, rather than pure state appropriations. Rent is by far the largest revenue source that FERF has. Anyway, I said, as we were tasked in the summer of 2012 with taking a deep dive into the FM costs, our analysis was necessary so the information could be provided to the administration and they could be making an appropriate decision. Fortunately for me, over the course of the 18 months preceding that point, the administration had been very supportive of allowing my office to staff up in a way that we brought in some very skilled individuals that were able to handle large financial data sets and accurately report what the story of the data was telling them. So we were able to do that. We thought we were equipped to do this in a good way. So we undertook to compare our FM cost to that of a private industry. To do so, we needed to compare apples to apples. We needed to benchmark our FM cost against BOMA reported FM cost. And we needed our current cost to be configured in a comparable format to the costs contained in the BOMA reports. So we matched all the costs in the state-owned facilities to the 5 categories of BOMA cost. The categories of the BOMA costs were cleaning, repair and maintenance, roads and grounds, security, and administrative. Querying the transaction level FM cost was made a bit easier than it would have been a few years earlier, since we as a state had recently implemented a new enterprise resource platform that gave us a better access to financial data that we needed. In the course of calculating a rentable cost per square foot for each of these 5 categories, we actually compiled expense data and cost per square foot amounts on each of the BOMA subcategories. There were 24 of them in all. I don't want to get overly detailed here, but what I do want to do is give you a sense of the comparison that we did reach. So I'll mention the types of subcategories we compiled our data into with regard to the repair and maintenance category. The subcategories were payroll, electrical, elevator, fire and life, safety, general building exterior, interior, HVAC, parking lot, plumbing, and structural roof. Those are the cost buckets that we put everything into. As you can imagine, the process of analyzing real estate transactional data is not a straightforward exercise. And as our business analysts dug into the details, there would often be questions that they'd come up with as to how to group certain costs, because they were dealing with costs at a very low level and were trying to move them into a higher level so they could compare them to those 5 BOMA categories. Well, it was at this point that the agency's facilities management director was very useful, because he was able to assist us in understanding and properly aligning those costs. So we involved Stream in that. Some of the assumptions we made during this process were as follows. We assumed that in the 2012 labor costs were going to be representative of our normal FM operation. We assumed a $2,500 cost associated with each non-payroll position, or each position. We assumed the labor costs for maintenance staff were assigned either to a specific building or a complex of buildings. And we assumed in cases where labor costs were posted to complex buildings that the costs were distributed to a specific building based on, as Tommy referred to, the building's percentage of the total square footage of the buildings within that complex. We just allocated it. At the end of the data analysis process, the categories of cost and how they matched to the BOMA figures were as follows. Our analysis of the state's cost data concluded the state cost per square foot was $5.31, whereas the BOMA reported median cost per square foot was only $4.05. The comparison figures we referenced were from the BOMA's 2011 Experience Exchange Report. As you can see, 4 of the 5 categories reflected a higher cost per square foot by the state as compared to BOMA. On the state side of the comparison, we found the cost leaders in each category to be the following. Under cleaning, found that routine contracts comprised 80% of that amount. Under repair and maintenance, the payroll was the leader at 43% of that cost. 100% of roads and grounds was due to landscaping. 96% of security was due to contracts. And general office expenses comprised half of the administrative number. Now, when you drill into the repair and maintenance, the story behind the data started to become clear. The leading cost factor in the repair and maintenance cost category was payroll. We found that we spent 67 cents per square foot on direct labor costs, whereas the BOMA reported figure was only 39 cents per square foot. A difference of 28 cents per square foot just for that one subcategory. So in a $6 million portfolio, that's $1.7 million. The difference between how much direct labor we had spread out in our facilities versus what the BOMA reported standards were. Another way to look at that is that the direct labor expenses in 2012, when compared to BOMA, the state's cost per square foot was 72% higher than BOMA reported. Yeah, let that sink in a moment. 72% higher. So, that is in the overview of the process we followed as we dug down deep into the cost details in an effort to come up with an industry comparison. After briefing the senior leaders in general services, our next step was to share the results with the administration. Our commissioner did that in the fall of 2012. In our report, we provided a summary level of our findings, along with a detailed supporting information along with that, down to the individual positions involved and the locations where they worked. The result was that we received a go-ahead from the administration to begin the procurement process. So hopefully that gives you a taste of what it is that we did when we were assessing the situation in Tennessee and trying to figure out whether it was on par with that of the industry. And we feel that our efforts and the fact-based analytical process we followed in comparing the cost against BOMA reported cost proved to be useful since it provided our state's executive leadership with the relevant data at a time when they were taking a close look at the condition of the real estate portfolio and needed to know how the cost of the state's FM operations in FERF stacked up against FM costs being reported by private industry. That's the process that we followed to make our comparison. Now I'd like to turn the mic over to about communications.
Thank you, Ron. I'm David Robertson, and I'm the Director of Communications for the Department of General Services. It's a position that I've held for not quite 3.5 years now. I'm going to talk about some things that I wasn't present to see at the time. At the beginning of this transition to a managed services contract, I wasn't working in this position. In fact, we did not have a full-time communications person in the office at the time. We had someone who was valiantly trying to manage both communications and legislative affairs, which is absolutely at least 2 full-time jobs. One of the things that has changed as we've moved ahead is that we do now have a full-time communications person, me, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've seen here and refer back to some things that happened before. And I have some colleagues here who were here to witness it and can answer questions about that if some of those come up. There are many things that we handled well regarding the transition to a managed services contract, and Tommy's talked about some of the things that we weren't doing very well before, and I'm going to talk about some things now that weren't done well. There are some things that we did very well, and you'll be hearing some more about that later on today. I mean, Mike is going to talk about some things that happened very well in procurement. Our operations go well. Governance, we have a very robust governance system. So you'll hear about a lot of things that have been accomplished well, but I'm going to have to point out a few things that weren't. And one of the things that wasn't handled well was the communications around this. And this is partly because of different audiences, different expectations, different understandings, and different needs for information. And what I've heard described by some of the people who were around here at the time is that we didn't say what we were going to do, we just did it. And so it's easy to understand that in that kind of an environment, people can have different ideas about what is going on and why, and we didn't address that in a good way. That has called into question our credibility and some of our motivations for doing some of the things that we did. Although this has been a number of years ago, now back to 2012 and 13, we're still dealing with some of the ramifications of the fact that we didn't do our communications properly. So I'm going to talk about some lessons learned here. I wish I could say that all the things that we're going to outline here are things that we did. Unfortunately, a lot of them are things that we didn't do, and the value of them has been reinforced for us now. And we will. So if you decide to go down this path yourself, hope you'll learn from some of our learnings and not make some of the mistakes that we made. First off, I want to talk about is different audiences. And if you're going to be communicating around this, you need to recognize the fact that you have different audiences, and those audiences all have different needs for information. They have a different set of assumptions about what is going on, and they have different responses to the information they receive. First off is our executive branch agencies. Now, they're going to be thinking first off, why are we doing this? What's in it for me? Will it affect the services that I offer? And they're going to be cautious. So will be their approach to it. The legislature is going to have a different ideas about entering into a contract like this. They'll think, why are we doing this? Is it really needed? They're going to think about state employees who are a vocal constituency. They're going to think about, is this really going to save money for the state? If this saves money for the state, what are we going to be doing with that money? They're going to think about what their constituents view about this, and they're going to also have a range of partisan concerns about what does my party think about this? What does the other party think about this? What do different elements of the legislature think about this whole thing? And that's going to influence their attitudes toward it also. State employees are going to have a set of questions. First, they're going to be saying, why are we doing this? And then there's going to be the understandable attitude, well, is my job going to be at risk? If it's not mine, how many state jobs are going to be at risk? Are there going to be reductions in force? If this is successful, might there be more reductions in force? They're going to be worried about it. The design and construction industry is going to have some questions. In our particular case, the fact that we're moving to a contract for facilities management raised questions about, well, what exactly is this vendor going to be doing? Might they be doing design work for capital projects? Is that going to take away some of my work? Am I going to have new competitors? Maybe I should talk to the legislature about this. The news media are going to have another specific set of questions. They're going to also want to know, why is the state doing this? And they're going to be suspicious that the reason that you give them might not be the real reason. So they're going to be particularly attuned to that. They're going to want to know what the legislature thinks, what state employees think. They're going to think about who's going to get the contract for that work. And state contracting is something that always attracts attention because of, concerns. Is the contract awarded fairly? Has there been any influence peddling involved? Has the winning vendor been making any political contributions we should look at? They're going to be skeptical. Finally, there's the public, and the public are going to say, well, why is the state doing this? But then they're going to like the idea that if the state is going to be saving money and operating more economically, that's great. But they're going to also say, how's that money going to be used? They're also not going to be well positioned to sort out competing claims and counterclaims about what is going on. One of the areas for improvement in our communication about this is that we were not aggressive as we could have been about telling our story. We're going to save money for the state, and we're going to make things operate more efficiently. What could be wrong with that? I mean, everybody's in favor of that, right? People aren't opposed to saving money, but for some of their audiences, there are other issues that take precedence. So if you proceed down this path, don't miss the chance to tell your story as early and as often as you can. This involves the old newspaper advice about telling all the W's here. Who? This means all the who's. I mean, you need to explain that the executive branch agencies have a role in this, but also the legislature and the non-executive branch agencies, bodies, and the vendor and subcontractors have a role in this. It's not just something that's being done by the Department of General Services or whatever its corollary is in your state, and that's something that wasn't understood. Also, it has been presented presented in some news media coverage as something that is driven by the department and that's not widely participatory. Be clear about what you're doing, but be equally clear about what you're not doing. Terry Cowles mentioned yesterday that higher education had to be brought into the fold because there were questions in the second procurement about exactly what would be involved in this, and we hadn't done a good job of telling them. So that's another area for improvement for us, and a mistake that I hope you can avoid. To the degree possible, be clear about the timeline for the entire process. Tell them when things are going to happen. In our case, what we eventually wound up doing is posting a timeline on the state website so that people could see what was going to happen. There was a distinct plan for this, and it was proceeding along a thought-out process and not just happening spontaneously or without any thought. However, on your deadlines, as on anything else, don't overpromise. Make sure before you say we're going to have something done by such and such a date that you can do it, and don't speculate about the dates. If you can't make a good statement about when something's going to be done. Don't speculate. Speculation and educated guesses have a way of being interpreted as promises, and then if you don't make the date that you speculated, then it's the thing is failing. They weren't able to make the deadlines. This is falling apart. Be specific. Don't let people who are opposed by what you're doing define the scope of your work or raise alarm in places where there's no cause for concern. And this leads into the last one, is the why, and that's the big one. No matter how many times you say what it is that you're doing, we're trying to improve services and save money for the state. It can't be overstated. It can't be said too often. Your opponents and people, there are going to be people who oppose this for a variety of reasons. They're going to suggest alternative motives. So they're doing this for some other reasons. Some of these are going to be plausible. Some are not going to be plausible. But you need to be consistent about saying we're doing this to save money for our state and to improve services, and keep doing it over and over again. Couple of things about the news media, and they're unique in that they have a significant opportunity for influencing what others think about this, and media interpretations are contagious. But the news media's role is not to educate people about what you're doing. You need to tell the story yourself, because it is not their job to tell your story. It's their job to give an objective accounting of what is going on, but what is your reason for doing this, and your goal is your goal, and it's not necessarily one they share, because there are other goals out there, and they're not going to decide to champion yours over some others. They'll look for conflict, disagreement, and inconsistencies, because that's what makes an exciting news story. And so be aware that they're going to be looking for those kind of things, because that's part of their job. Some may eventually decide that what you're doing is a good thing. Some may not. So don't expect them to do your work for you. There are three basic rules for political communication, and bear in mind that this is political communication. It's not. It's not really education. It is a political message. It's more accurate to think of it as a competition between messages and to treat it that way. Your message is going to be competing against messages suggested by a number of other people. First, you need to control the message. Remember what I said earlier about telling your story early and often, and this is one of the basic principles of effective institutional communications, and it's borne out by our own experience. Be the first one out of the box with your story, because everything else is essentially a reaction to the first story, and if you don't get out there first with the news, then what's happening is going to be defined by someone else. I'll give you an example from our own experience. When we were rolling out the second procurement, some of the discussion was, well, we should, partly because of some things we learned from the first procurement and some state employees, there was a reduction in force and we lost some positions. And we discussed the idea that we should perhaps mention how many state employees might be affected by this. Well, at that point in the planning, we didn't have good data on that, and we decided rather than put out a number that might not be right, we're not going to make a statement about the number of employees that are affected. As soon as this got out, the State Employees Association immediately began raising the alarm. This is going to affect 10,000 state jobs. Well, the state of Tennessee has not much more than 40,000 state employees. So the idea that 1 in 4 state employees are involved in facilities management is not only ludicrous, it would be a sign that we desperately needed to be doing something differently than have a quarter of the state workforce maintain our building. However, in the absence of another number, we had media outlets pick that up and report it. Now, they're going to be affecting 10,000 state jobs. Up to 10,000 state employees may lose their job. It was not remotely true. There was never a chance it was going to be anything that large. But we had to play catch up on that one because we hadn't come out with a better number at first. Second, be sure you can document everything you say. As I've mentioned before, a speculative comment or a statement of something as a potential goal will be translated into a promise or a commitment to do that, even if you don't mean it, because it's just going to morph into that. Another example from our experience, we initially in our real estate planning in the early days of Stream. Launched a program that we thought might be able to reduce the portfolio by as much as 1 million square feet, and this was something that was talked about. Yeah, that's a good goal for us, and that's we think we could probably do that. Let's make that our objective and shoot for that. Well, it became reported in the news media is we're going to reduce the portfolio by 1 million square feet. As it became clear that we weren't going to reach that level, although we did come pretty close, it's a sign of failure. Oh, you said you were going to do it 1 million square feet and you didn't, and so that's cited later on as evidence that the agency can't meet its commitments. We never promised that we were going to do 1 million square feet, and as time went on, there were some other factors that made it impossible for us to meet the 1 million square foot goal, but we did pretty well and came quite close to it. It's still cited as, well, General Services has made promises and they didn't keep them. It wasn't a promise, it was a goal, but it metamorphosed into that. Third, if you leave anything undefined, people who are opposed to what you're doing will define it for you. For example, and we've had confusion on this procurement about what facilities management is. What is incorporated into facilities management? You need to define even your basic terms, because those can be misconstrued, misunderstood, or misrepresented by people who are not in favor of what you're trying to do. John Hull mentioned yesterday and showed a slide of some of the headlines that we've seen as we were moving through this. And he's correct. We have had some inaccurate and misleading reporting on the issue of facilities management and this contract, these two contracts in particular. These have been disappointing. Some of them are for factors beyond our control. It probably doesn't happen in your state, but some people say that there's partisan bias in reporting here. That happens here sometimes. Maybe you guys are immune to that. There's opposition to the governor, and this has been something that the governor has, as John also mentioned, the governor has been vocal in his support for this, and so he's become identified for it. So if you're opposed to the governor and he's for this, then it's something else that probably that you should resist. There's some people who just don't trust state government or the people who are working in state government. So you may need to be prepared to deal with that. But the basic message is that you need to be extremely careful about controlling those things that you can control, because it's your responsibility to manage those well. Mark Twain's quote here is interesting. Twain himself started his career as a journalist. He was a newspaper reporter. And although this comment is sometimes cited as evidence that Twain was admitting that newspapers are liars, it's actually a little more nuanced than that, I think. Twain knew that from his own experience that reporting is tough work and news gathering is a difficult task, and it's hard to get a story right sometimes. So he's not saying that reporters necessarily lie, but I think he is saying that there are inaccuracies in there that just come up because of the way the news gathering process works. Several years ago, when I was in college, the first news writing course that I took was taught by a professor who was himself a reporter at the state capitol newspaper. And in this class, he did a little exercise for us early on and said, "How many people in the class have ever had a newspaper story that mentioned you?" And so hands go up, and it was somewhere more than half the class had a newspaper story written about him. And then he said, "Now raise your hand if every single statement in the story was accurate." Only one person had a hand up. And so the professor says, "Remember that this is true about every story that you read in the newspaper." Again, he's not saying that papers lie, just that it's difficult to get all the facts straight, and it's a tough job. We need to help get the story out, but we have a responsibility, particularly, to be sure that we manage all the elements of the reporting that we can. I think that brings us to the Q&A section for this block, and the three of us are happy to respond to any questions that you might have. I'd ask that you use your table mic if you have a question here. And Sarah, do we have any online ones that somebody's going to read for us? We could do that.
I do know that one of our live stream viewers emailed to ask if the PowerPoint slides and materials will be available, and the answer is yes. We're going to send them out to you guys during the break in just a minute, so we'll have those ready for you. So can anybody in the room kick us off with some questions?
So I have a question for Ron. How long and how many staff did it take to clean the data and normalize it so you could compare it to BOMA? Seems like a big activity, and I'm trying to get a sense on how many staff and how long it's going to take me to do the same thing.
Okay. I'm in the Office of Financial Management is where I worked, and there were probably 3 or 4 business analysts that were involved in that process directly. Each had different areas. We broke it apart, but 3 or 4.
For how long?
It took about, as we learned off and on, probably a month or 2 at least. It kind of we didn't know exactly each step we were going to take when we started the process. So it was to a degree, it was a learning process. There would be a question that would come from the commissioner's office, who he was a real estate, had a real estate background, or others. They would come up with a different way to look at it. They wanted to slice and dice it a little bit differently and find out what that said. So it was a process, but it was at least a month and a half or so, and 3 or 4 of my direct reports were involved in it.
That was some of my curiosity as well. I mean, you guys have admitted that things were being done the wrong way. Did that delineation include going back and it's kind of dummy in, dummy out, the invoicing, the costs? I see your costs on the security side were quite high. Were you able to go back and delineate through the general ledger categories and apply the actual costs for those categories to do the comparison, or how did you go back and get that correct history if it wasn't being done properly?
Well, as I mentioned, maybe about 3 years before this process started, we had a new financial module that was launched, and that financial module, called Edison, gave us there's fields in there that have the transaction information that we needed. We just needed somebody to identify the fields that needed to be looked at. So we had a skill set of our folks on staff had the skill set to look into the data, but we just needed some guidance as to what fields to look into. And what we would do is we'd group things together, and we found that the real estate management folks at the time would give us some guidance as to which categories to put them in. But I guess back to your point, we had every transaction that was occurred was in the books, and we had the ability to look at every line item and look back for the last couple of years to see if there's a comparison to. We could do that.
So one of your major lines then wasn't miscellaneous or something that wasn't?
No, it was.
Okay.
It definitely was. And the slide up there, or I was talking about the subcategories of repair and maintenance. The one I did not say was miscellaneous, and that had $1 million in cost. But when we did the report, in the notes section, we explained what the composition of miscellaneous was. We did another deep dive in there, so knowing that question would come up.
Thank you. This is another large category. What was the historical use of P cards and that type of thing for transactions? Were you able to dive into that as well?
At that point, there wasn't really an ability to do that. As Mr. Perry or Mike can comment on that, but we really didn't have that ability.
Let me address that. Primarily at that time, the P card was being used for those small purchases that were not available on a contract. So those would have overall been insignificant in the grand scheme of things.
Regarding the BOMA compared to your all's costs, one of the significant line items was security. And under the state, you had about $1.23, and under BOMA, it identified 38 cents.
The state was significantly higher. Yeah.
Can you speak to has that changed through your contracted service method, or what's the significant driver in that?
You have to remember, when we went to this model for our security, it was right after 9/11. And up to that point, we did not have security. What we had was watchkeepers. So just short of, rolling a cannon in the front door, basically you came in and out with pretty well whatever you wanted to. So after 9/11, we did do a much deeper look at what security needs to be in our state facilities. We began to go to formal ID badges, and we teed this thing up. We also looked at our previous contract and recognized that based upon the type of labor we were getting, it was just short of the contractor showing up at one of the labor halls on Monday morning going, "How would you like to be a security guard this week?" Okay? So we put much more defined technical requirements in the contract for that contractor at the time, and specified to get the good people, you're going to have to pay around this amount hourly to get them. So we really went overboard in trying to address the the threats and the fears at the time, as well as improve upon the previous contract that we'd had. So, yes, costs were significantly spiked, but we have, through working with our partner, we have gone back the other way to where this is much more manageable and within standards now.
Another question about security is your security system enterprise-wide now? It includes the executive, legislative, and administrative sides of the business, so to speak. So you have a continuous system of security rather than in our state we have a chopped-up security system where each one of the branches takes care of their own security.
Well, that's where we are with this idea that we're going to move forth with centralizing the rest of general government's facilities into the facilities revolving fund. At this point in time, primarily the security that we have is within FERF. It varies a little bit once you get into the lease spaces, because obviously you're dealing with the landlords, so there's some limitations there as to what they may or may not let you do. But in the state facilities within FERF, we do have standard security systems. Some are much more powerful than others based upon what we've been able to do with funding over the years and where the most pain points have been. But we do have basically the executive branch on the same ID card. We have access readers in the majority of those buildings. So we have a much better, robust system now within FERF than we did years ago. We have security within the legislative buildings, but that's a little bit of a conversation between the executive branch and legislative branch as to what they want it to look like or how robust they want it to work. And it seems to vary from day to day, so we're having to deal with that. But primarily where we're able to get the most success is within the executive branch.
Does JLL manage just the security guards, or do they handle the break fix and the access for the security systems as well?
They handle the security guards. They help us monitor the security system, but primarily the security system is the Department of General Services. Case in point, if we have someone in an agency who feels there's been a breach of security within, say, their records management area, they will reach out to us and request that, can we get a report based upon access in and out of a particular area in our building, say, for the last 30 days, so that they can do their monitoring to see if somebody has been in there that should not have been in there. That's especially critical for those agencies that deal with the IRS, because they are really ramping up the controls on people who have access to personal data.
So the break fix on cameras, badge readers, strikes, you name it, that doesn't fall on JLL, or it does?
No.
Okay.
So I had a communications question for David or for the panel. I'd like to preface this question by saying I've been happily married for 32 years, but I've learned over those years it's every once in a while it's better to beg for forgiveness than to ask for permission. I get everything you're saying about the communication strategy, but I'm wondering if you could speculate, and I recognize I'm asking you to speculate. Had you done the robust communication up front, do you think there's a chance that the bureaucracy, the death by 1,000 cuts, would have prevented you from having a successful first phase where you saved as much money and then used that business case to then go on to phase 2?
Again, I was not here at the time, so it is going to be speculation. But I think that the benefits of an aggressive campaign of educating people about what we would have done would have outweighed the deficits. There certainly would be more questions raised as you're educating people about what you're doing. But we live today with the legacy of some of the things that we did and that we didn't explain, that make people question our motives even now. And when we weren't aggressive with just the basic information, we're doing this because it will save money for the state, and that money can be used for citizen-facing services. And we didn't say that over and over again, and we should have. My colleague Thad Watkins has a follow-on comment there.
Thank you, David. I'm Thad Watkins, General Counsel. I was here during those early days. And let me just set the stage. This is the first time we had ever done it. And we had a new administration in, and a lot of people who were fairly new to the whole governmental process and understanding who the stakeholders would be. They were successful business people. If it made good business sense, then why not do it? All they had to worry about previously were owners and shareholders and board of directors. It's a different ballgame in state government. Also, and I need to emphasize this, I had been previously exposed in state government during my career to high-profile matters, but in our department, most of the people who were involved in this process had never been involved in anything high-profile. We were always the forgotten department. And a consequence of that, we have learned all of this, and we're happy, very happy to share all of this with you. I would recommend that as you get into this, you develop a communications plan. You decide who is going to be the contact point, communication point. You don't need multiple speakers. And there's training out there. I would say everywhere you are, you can get courses. I used to put my attorneys through courses that they use. People, usually former or present journalists, run these courses where they teach business people or government officials how to deal with the media, the do's and don'ts, the media cue card on the 8 ways to answer every question. Those are things that are easily obtained and learned. But our people didn't have those skills, unfortunately, and we didn't have the staff, the experienced communication staff at that time either. Now, there's one other thing I might add about this. The word transparency is very important. If you don't have it, or you perceive not to have it, or operating in secret, then you're a crook. All you have to do is, go to a family reunion or go to your local bar or diner or somewhere and talk to people and get their impression of what's going on in your state government. And that's the true barometer, not what you're hearing from your colleagues or anything. That's the true barometer. And they didn't trust it. It just was too radical. Things that are done every day in the business world can't be done this way without a lot of speculation. And one of the most critical things is I would imagine in every one of your states that you've got some kind of Freedom of Information law. We call it our Tennessee Public Records Act. And it is very broad here in the state of Tennessee of what records are open. In fact, they're all open unless there's a specific law that makes them confidential. And that, my friends, includes emails and communications, all kinds of communications back and forth. Do you think that anybody involved in the early planning of this and the discussions back and forth and everything had any idea that their conversations, their email conversations, would be a matter of public record? And all the false starts and different ideas? No, they didn't. So you need to keep all of that in mind, because transparency is real. It's not just a term. It's not a cliche. Transparency means when you're a steward over government funds and taking care of government properties and everything, the citizens and the taxpayers have a right to see it, see how you do it, and know why and understand. And everybody needs to be educated on that in your organizations. What may not have been interesting ever before to the people will become very, very interesting once you embark on a program like this.
Oh, I got a few other thoughts on that too. We've discussed this, but for our audience here, I guess who hadn't heard that, you look at things differently depending on where you are in a political cycle of an administration. So, we're trying to look back on your question and think where we are today is different than where we were at the beginning of this new governor's administration term. So you understand what I'm saying, that the strength of the governor's will only gets you so far late in their term. I had this conversation with him in the last 6 months, and no regrets about the way it was done the first time. Now, today, where he is defending FM outsourcing on a daily basis with the press, I haven't asked him. He may have a different view, but as of 6 months ago, he was still on board with, no, we clearly would not have gotten where we are today had we not taken that get it done approach. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I guess you got to look where you are in your administration's life cycle and say, are we at a good point? Are they going to, in the honeymoon phase, for instance, they're just going to follow whatever we want to do? Or are we in the latter phase, we're having to fight for everything we want to try to accomplish? Is this the right time to start an initiative like this where you are in your own state?
So what I'm hearing, and just want to make sure that I understand, to clarify what you're saying is that in any sort of strategic deployment of whatever initiative you may have, this could be a whole different subject, that the communication and change management strategy needs to be a very integral part of what you're going to do. You should be thinking about that beforehand, before you even introduce an idea, before you're thinking about the deployment, the strategy of who needs to be contacted, who needs to be communicated to, how that information is going to flow. And more importantly, what I heard you say was to make sure that everybody around the table who has a piece of this has the necessary training to be able to carry the message perhaps to their own audience, but to ensure that it's a very consistent message, and that all the players know where all the other players are at any one particular time for strategic deployment.
That's a pretty good summary, and you did it in much less time than I took to to go through it.
Sorry, just a quick question. Could you describe a little bit about you were talking about the challenges of stakeholder engagement. Could you talk about, excuse me, your stakeholder engagement the first time around through the first procurement and then now through your second time here, and what lessons you learned and how it changed how you approached it?
Well, as I sort of alluded to, we for the first procurement we didn't really do very much outreach, and as I said, we didn't even have a full-time communications director at the time. For the second procurement, not only had we learned some things about from the first procurement, but the second procurement was actually being managed by the CFG office, Terry Cowell's office, and he spoke yesterday. They have their own communications person. So we've had a lot more resources to bring to bear on this. There's been a lot more outreach to different audiences. I mean, visiting with particular legislators about it. John has given talks about what we're doing to various professional groups. So we have been much more aggressive in explaining what we're doing to a variety of audiences the second time, and none of that really happened the first time. We could still have done more. But we certainly did I think a much more effective job the second time around. Part of the problem the second time around, as I've mentioned, is that we were dealing to a certain extent with the legacy of the way things were handled the first time, and some of the suspicions that were created because we hadn't done some of that initial outreach.
I would add, the first time there were presentations to the legislature about the business case, but it was very high level, and it's like, this makes sense. Everybody understand this? Okay, we're just going to go ahead and do it. And then we just acted. And this time it's like, no, we've got to bring you along and talk about procurement and really understand the contract language and the KPIs and all those kind of details were had to be brought along this time. Because as Thad described, it was new to us and we didn't really understand. It's like, this makes sense, so why wouldn't you do it? Everybody's on board, let's just act. And it's not the way it works today in the state of Tennessee, 6, 7 years later.
Contributing to some of the concerns with the transition, I was surprised to see the numbers yesterday. Typically, when a JLL will come over, the retention is near 100% and keeping staff and transferring. In this case, the numbers were very low. Were there some reasons why so few were retained?
Covering that in another section, is that better to wait for that?
It was a
Oh,
big
you need to use a
difference in
mic.
operating model.
Thanks, Paul. It helps our live stream viewers.
That's all right. I can't remember who mentioned it. I think it was, yeah, with the skill set wasn't there. Tommy mentioned that. The skill set wasn't there. And so we brought in a different model that required a higher skill set. So a lot of people were just didn't have that. A lot also were brought over were trained up that wanted to do it. A lot of them didn't want to and chose to go, as Tommy mentioned, other places within Tennessee government or retire. That was the biggest issue, and it was the problem that we were there to help solve. Is you didn't have the skill set, you had a lot of headcount, but didn't have the skill set to do the work, so you had to reach out to contractors, and you were essentially double costed.
I want to echo and reinforce what David Roberson said about getting the message out. Just because you and your colleagues understand a term or understand what it means doesn't mean you don't need to still define it to the general public. The figure 10,000 employees could lose their job is a literal application of the term, a broad interpretation of the term facilities management. What we mean is managing the actual physical facilities, not running the operations. But if you say facility management, it can broadly interpreted. It could mean that that company will take over operating prisons, hospitals, and other state facilities, and operating all of that. And yes, if you extrapolate that further, it could be up to 10,000 employees. But no one bothered to define it or make it clear that we're strictly talking about the brick and mortar buildings and facilities and keeping them up. Nobody thought to make that clear. And so that was lost. That was an opportunity lost early because of a lack of allowing other people to define a term. It's as simple as that. Don't be redundant. Don't take anything for granted, and understand your audience.
I'd just like to say one thing from as the chief procurement officer for the state of Kentucky. One of my concerns has always been with regard to our contracting the way we do with competitive negotiation and the relationships with the vendors or private developers. One of the things in controlling the message, and I'm getting ready to release an RFP, has been to ensure fairness, because I also am legislatively responsible for any protest resolution. And that's one of the very key elements, because if you get a disappointed vendor out there, then then there could be an injunction or something that could really delay the particular capital project that you want to move forward on. I'm getting ready also to release the message, but it's a controlled message to the city and to the legislators and the tenants and throughout, which are all very, very interested, but I have to limit that until the posting is completed for about 30 days, and then as the RFPs are released, they're released all at the same time based on the posting, say a build-to-suit. Because fairness is very key, and there are very sensitive vendors and private developers out there that have proprietary knowledge, and if you are looking for barriers to those particular projects, you're going to do an RFI, and you're going to have them come in and tell you their particular plan, of which you need to be very careful of that information. And that's why also with regard to lobbyists and things like that, I do not meet one-on-one with lobbyists. I can't afford that. And one of the things I do is that I require either my deputy or my commissioner for facilities to meet on an open basis. And they have to identify why they're there and what they want to provide and what lobbyists are there, because I'm trying to do everything I can to preclude future roadblocks with regard to awarding a contract. So all I'm saying is that the message has to be clear. Everything that has been said is exactly on target. But I, from my standpoint, I have to control that to a degree on certain information until the RFP is out there and totally posted in fairness with regard to that vendor, because I've got to be very careful that I try to minimize the threat of a potential protest. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, one more. So, Tommy, you had talked about the revolving account, and at one point you're dealing with the deferred maintenance, and you were considering a fee or charged a fee for a period of time to cover that. It was like a 3-year window, if I recall correctly. And then the feds came in and said no more, right? So I'm assuming the revolving account was non-appropriated, but the agencies you were charging, they were hitting their appropriated funds for that extra fee that was being charged?
No, what you had was we would identify the cost of operating a particular facility. We would then factor into it a formula that would say, based upon a forward look, what do we project we need to do in the next 5 years to the facility to keep it updated? What do we need to do in the next 10 years? And we'd apply that formula that would say if the rent then based upon actual cost was $10 a square foot, then we may need to charge $13 a square foot, so that when we get to 5 years down the road, we've got the $1.5 million to put in new carpet, new paint, new open office landscaping, whatever the case may be. Those agencies who normally get state appropriations, yes, they got additional funding in their budgets for it. The agencies that primarily deal with the feds and they pass their cost on to the federal government just increase the amount they were passing on to the feds, and then that's when they came in and said, we're not going to accept non-expenditures or future expenditures. We'll only accept actual cost. So that's where we had to go back in our reserves that we had built up. We ended up reducing rents for a couple of years in order to reimburse the feds for the overpayment.
So do you have any documentation? Do you have any documentation from the feds you can share with the state of Washington as far as their decision and response back?
I'm sure we can find something along the way below these many years when they come in every couple of years and completely audit this thing through the Finance Administration Department. I'm sure there are reports and findings and so forth that they've done that kind of talks about this.
Awesome.
Some of this is the classic of this is the conversation we're having, but don't expect me to send you an email saying you need to pay me $2 million back because you overbill me.
It seems like this is one of those opportunities for states to come together and talk about this challenge in a much deeper way, and then to engage with the federal government. Because we talk about being competitive and delivering strong services as a government, but when we're trying to serve our tenant customers, you compare the private sector and us, they can collect that amount, the exact same situation. We operate proprietary accounts. So if that's a position that the feds took with you all, and if that truly is something consistent across how they do that through their entire division of cost allocation, it's a huge barrier for state government in managing facilities and being competitive. So I throwing out, maybe it's a NASCA future workshop or discussion, the potential opportunity to dig into that further and then engage with the federal government to have that conversation to help us be successful.
Couple of points on that. One, as John described yesterday, that was one of the reasons why we seriously, in certain cases over the years, looked at leasing, because you could ensure that when it was time to put in new carpet, new paint in a leased facility, that would happen because that's what you were paying them for. From a state government point of view and NASCA point of view, everything obviously is ruled based upon the GATSB requirements. And for those of you who are tuned in, GATSB and the feds have been looking at the whole real estate issue for the past several years related to leases and what's defined as a capital lease. I am really concerned with where they may head with that if suddenly you have a lease for anything, whether it's a vehicle, whether it's a copy machine, a printing press, or real estate that's longer than a year, if that requires you to then go through a formula that reduces the amount of funding you can then pass on to the feds, then that's even, adding on to the woes we already have with the current rules. So it's one of those of stay tuned, because they're still noodling over this and what it's going to mean to the states. But that could have a major impact on the way that state governments do business.
One other thing, and this is not specifically the topic of this year's program, but perhaps for a future, but it does involve the interaction between the state and the federal government. We undertook a pretty robust plan to reconfigure, redesign, and reorganize and rearrange state working spaces in our buildings, and it has resulted in a extremely significant net decrease in the amount of space we have to manage. However, don't get too far in your planning on those things without involving those that are partially or fully funded through state revenue sharing, federal revenue sharing. You better get with them pretty early before you make any plans, because they're not going to let you, they'll cut you off. They're not going to let you mess with any of their funded stuff until they look at the plans and they make sure their specifications are met, and if they okay it. We've been fooling with that on a few things, and that's another learning, a teaching moment that we maybe someday can discuss.
I've got a question for JLL probably. I'm not sure we were clear in our description. Does everybody know what BOMA is, first of all? Building Owners and Managers Association. Well, that's primarily focused on office buildings. So there are not good benchmark industries for non-office building types. So what Ron described was accurate, but it was really focused on our office portfolio at the time. With the round two, I guess I was wondering if JLL could offer any insights as to how they may want to track their costs differently for, higher education has their own standards of how they allocate square footages, for instance, prisons, you can go on and on and on. So any recommendations JLL would have for the audience here as to what you would suggest to help them be better prepared in these other non-office building types?
Yeah, there are other expense benchmarking groups out there. You got dollars and cents for shopping centers. There's Whitestone, I think, which was used in some of the business case analysis for the second phase for more government and higher ed. So they're out there, but when you get into more of the specialized facilities like a campus, the benchmarking is actually much more subjective to all the other things that are happening. Their office buildings are much more straightforward, even though they can be the hours of operation, the age, the condition, the populations, all kinds of things can skew operating cost. That's compounded even more as you move into the higher ed space. So the benchmarking becomes much more difficult. I do think, though, the chart of accounts that you saw that was expressed in BOMA is still pretty standard, and it can come across to the higher ed. And you're going to have some buildings in a higher ed facilities that are behaving more like office buildings, standard hours, administrative space. It's when you get into the other spaces, you almost have to break it into different pieces. That makes sense.
We have time for maybe one more question. Anybody want to go? Any live stream questions? Okay. For our live stream viewers, we would love for you guys to engage, and please feel free to use the email. And also for our live stream viewers, if you scroll below your feed, we've added a new resource link that will take you to the documents that the state of Tennessee put together on both their first and second procurement operations, and I think some HR documents as well. So please be sure to check that out. Well, if there are no more questions, I think it is time for a break. We are going to start back promptly at 10:15 to stay on track with our schedule for our online folks. So let's take a quick 15, 20-minute break. Thank you all. Oh, and please help me thank our panelists. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Thank you all.